Figure out what kind of rental rate we need to make this project feasible. Okay, so we're going to start with the cost and we're going to back into a rental rate. And these are on the other spreadsheets now. So again, I'm not really expecting you to absorb every number, but here was our stuff that comes out of the design. So the architecture guys and ladies come up with how many square feet, of income producing product does this site yield? Are you guys gonna teach that, Frank?
You mean in planning or?
In these courses in the SHU-LI?
Well, they get exactly what you were saying, only what the presenters give them.
Okay, but I mean, you've got a site, right? You're gonna come up with a project. So they're gonna go through an exercise of figuring out how much product that can yield.
Oh, yeah. Will
Okay.
they need to do this? They will need to do this. If they don't learn it from you, they're on their own because with
But
their
isn't that
mentors.
supposed to be in like the design part?
Well, the mentors will
Okay,
help them.
all right, okay.
But they're going to absorb as much as they can and then ask a
Okay,
lot of
all right, well,
questions later.
someone, architect team is gonna look at the site and say, okay, here's the maximum amount of square footage we can get on this site.
Yeah.
Okay, the finance person doesn't do that, okay? But the finance person does say, okay, here are certain assumptions. I can go out and survey operating expenses for an office building, and I can look at vacancy rates. What kind of factor do I have to deduct, from market vacancy? And then again, another easier thing is to know what your costs are, okay? You can get our construction guy, give them the plans from the architects and say, okay, give me a quote on how much this is gonna cost. So we've got $41 million worth of cost. We've got vacancy rate, got operating expenses, and then we have financial assumptions. How is the lender gonna view this in terms of underwriting? The cap rate, what kind of loan to value ratio they're going to use, what interest rate they're going to base this on. And then the developer is going to say, okay, if I'm going to do this project, what return do I want on my equity?
What's the cap rate?
What is the cap rate? Okay, so the cap rate is how the lender, the buyer, ultimate buyer of the project and the investor, it is how they determine the value of the project. It generally, without going into a lot of detail, it's based on a number of factors. It is somewhat based on cost of capital, okay? So in current times, like across the United States, cap rates are rather low because the cost of capital is low. But then added on to that cost of capital, which is kind of a blend between what your debt interest rate is and what your required equity return is, you add on a factor for the risk of that particular project. So for example, I'm doing deals here in Covington, Kentucky in very pioneering locations. And I'm doing apartment stuff and converting vacant blighted buildings into living units in locations that aren't quite established yet. The appraisers, investors, they're telling me I have to use a 9% cap rate, all right? The banks, when those sold, do you know what the cap rate was? Do you guys know? It was awfully darn low. I mean, it was probably like 4%. Okay, it was very low. So that tells you the relative, how people view the relative riskiness of brand new construction right on the river, right downtown versus somewhat sketchy in Covington. So the lower the cap rate, the lower the risk the property is perceived to have, and therefore the higher the value, okay? So
Sort of
that's
like
what a
a-
cap rate is.
Like a credit rating? Not exactly, I know, but. like the
Not
percentage of risk.
exactly, but it has similarities
Uh-huh.
to that. Because it is an indication of the relative risk of that project.
Sorry, can you just say again, the lower cap, the lower the
Okay,
cap?
yeah, write this down. The lower the cap rate, the higher the value. And, you know, do the math. Take $100,000 and divide it by 5%. Then take $100,000 and divide it by 7%, you know, and you'll see how that impacts the results. So as you look at these assumptions, which assumptions do you think are the most speculative? Which assumption do you think I can't really predict very easily?
The cap rate.
The cap rate would be one.
Vacancy.
Vacancy, boy, when you guys do your pro formas, your stuff is going to be real sensitive to what you put in there for your vacancy allowance. Very sensitive. That to me is one of the biggest, you know, factors. Do you think your costs are speculative or not?
I think construction costs can really move.
They can, but I'm personally not that afraid of construction costs. You know, if you have a detailed plans and specifications and you have qualified contractors, unless it's some crazy rehab, you know, adaptive reuse, and that's where it gets hard. I'm not as afraid of construction as a lot of people are, but, you know, maybe that's just me. So what we're doing, we have all the assumptions except the rental rate here, right? And I'm gonna back into that. And again, if someone reminds me or has a place to put this, I can actually send you the spreadsheet so you can see the calculations. But, you know, here's kind of the steps I would go through. And first of all, I'm gonna figure out how much do I think I can borrow? And based on those assumptions, and then I'm going to say, you know, for now, let's just assume the cost and the value are going to be similar numbers. So I can borrow 31.3 based on this criteria. Then I'm going to figure out my cost of debt. And then I'm going to determine, based on the loan amount I'm likely to get and the interest rate I'm likely to get, how much debt service, you know, what's my mortgage payment going to be? And I need at least that much net operating income, right? Because I can't go negative. Then I'm going to determine, based on the fact that is, you know, someone taking some risk, I want a 12% return on this, right? If I don't come up with a good return, isn't it a lot easier than going through all this horrible development stuff and this hassle to write a check and tell your stockbroker to buy a couple stocks or something? And this is hard work. So I want a 12% return. And so I have to add on to the $2 million that I need to service my debt another amount of cash, right, to get the return that I want. And so that means that my minimum threshold is I've got to generate at least $3.5 million out of that square footage, you know, that the architect said I could squeeze on the site. But there's going to be a vacancy, right? So I can only count on 90% of that income. And when I back all that out, that says that I need to get rent of $22.80 a foot. So again, you know, we don't have enough time. This is a class I teach for a whole quarter, all that, you know, I'm doing tonight. But it will give you sort of a little method for figuring that out. Yes?
I have a quick question about the previous slide. It lists the architectural and engineering cost is 350,000.
Right.
That seems like an incredibly low percentage for such a large total project cost. Is that?
I think it seems high to me on that kind of a project myself.
Oh, is that just because of the simplicity of the architecture? Or-
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Gotcha.
yeah. I think for a suburban project, that seems a little bit high. What do you think, Frank?
Isn't that like less than 1%?
Architects never get paid enough.
Come on.
Frank.
I wouldn't focus too much on that.
I was just
but-
curious,
Yeah,
I'm
but
sorry.
no, that's, it's a good question. And I think what you should do is gather data on what those percentages are.
Well, I asked because I've worked
Because you've seen
on
the
some projects
percentage.
with a much higher percentage than that. so-
Okay. And you're, probably right. It's just that this project isn't that complicated.
Gotcha. That's what I assumed.
Okay. So, we need to get 2280 a foot to make the project feasible. Well, do we just say we're gonna go market the building at 2280? I mean, what if every single office building in the area is asking $15 a foot?
There needs to be a reason why you're at 2280.
There definitely needs to be a reason. You have to have some real distinguishing factor, right? And just a quick, little editorial comment. There's a lot of, criticism around here about the bland and boring architecture, right? And the materials that aren't exactly wonderful and how everything looks the same. But there's a reason. In Cincinnati, our rental rates are very depressed. I mean, we do not get high rents. Office rents in Cincinnati are pathetic, and we're lucky to get $15 a foot. Do you know what they are in Denver? They're $45 a foot. And you can't tell me there's that big of a differential of the cost, okay? So if you wonder why things kind of look cheap, it's because, of what these numbers are here. You can't build the, you just can't build the most wonderful thing in the world when you don't get anything. So, anyway, so sensitivity, and like I said, we can do a little demo about this, and I love these sensitivity tables. So I pulled out the things that I thought, could be a variation. The key assumptions in my pro forma were the required return. Okay, what if I'm willing to take less? I've got control over that, right? I don't have to get a 12%. What if I'm willing to take a little less? That vacancy allowance, whoever pointed that out, pro formas are very sensitive to that. And then someone said, that project costs could move. So I pulled out those three factors, and I tested what happens if I'm willing to maybe change my required return, and vacancy rates are a little bit different than I thought. How sensitive is that required rental rate? Well, if I'm going to stick to this 12%, and vacancy rates end up being 20%, well then I've got to get $25.65 a foot, okay? So that's a $3 type of differential. How sensitive are the returns to construction cost? And you can see that my returns really are not quite as sensitive to, or my rate is not quite as sensitive to construction costs. And if I look at the combination of vacancy and construction cost, that gives me another idea. So what this tool does is, you just never can fully mitigate the risks of the project, but if you can do this on the front end, you at least can quantify what it might be, and it makes you a lot less scared going into the project when you can say, okay, the worst thing that could possibly happen to me is this. And you know, I just think quantifying the possibilities, either it scares you enough not to do it, or it makes you feel a little bit more confident. But that's what drives me crazy. A lot of people will not go through the discipline to do it, and then they do stupid things and crazy things. And this is easy stuff to do. That's what bugs me, that people won't do it. Okay, so after, you know, I did this analysis and I got that number, $22.80 per square foot, and looked at some of the sensitivity. I'm, you know, go out and study the market, ask real estate office brokers, is that an achievable rent? What do you think? And assuming they say, yeah, you know, I think that that's achievable, then I'm going to say, okay, well now I'm going to look at the property acquisition. And can I buy the property at the right amount? That's very tricky sometimes. Sometimes to get site control, you have to act without full information or even with everything, you know, your ducks in a row. And I guess you all know the story of Brookwood Exchange, the second phase of Brookwood, where the developer went out and assembled, can't remember, it was like 100 properties, and spent like $20 million on the assembly, only to find out that this couple here was going to hold out and take this all the way to the state Supreme Court to fight eminent domain. And as a result, you know, they won. This is a landmark case in America. And so this project, which, gosh, had signed up Container Store, Crate and Barrel. Well, remember, what kills deals?
That's fine.
Time, right? He had all these great tenants signed up, and when he couldn't deliver a product because he was fighting the eminent domain case, those all swooped up to the Kenwood project. Time kills deals, right? Not to mention the $20 million that you sunk into the land acquisition. So anyway, that's just a quick commentary about that. So we're going to look at our backdoor analysis now. Okay, we have figured out that 2280 is kind of the required rent. And we've studied the market. And given all these things, now we're going to figure out how much can I afford to pay for the land. And here's a funny thing I keep hearing working in Covington.